Let me welcome everybody to the Nathanson Seminar Series, Legal Philosophy Between State and Transnationalism. I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Serena Parekh is with us from Northeastern University, where she's in the Department of Philosophy. Before joining Northeastern, Professor Parekh taught at the University of Connecticut, where she was jointly appointed in the Department of Philosophy there and their Human Rights Institute. She works primarily in social and political philosophy, feminist theory, continental philosophy, and the philosophy of human rights. Professor Parekh has published several articles on questions of global responsibility, especially for women's human rights violations, the impact of biotechnology on our autonomy and identity, and refugees and the problem of exclusion, which will also form part of the background for her paper today, Beyond the Ethics of Admission, Stateless People, Refugee Camps, and Moral Obligations. As well, her book, Hannah Arendt and the Challenge of Modernity, A Phenomenology of Human Rights, was published by Routledge in 2008. So I was very pleased to have Professor Parekh with us today. Our commentator is our very own Professor Alice MacLachlan from the Department of Philosophy. Professor MacLachlan works in ethical theory and social and political theory, and her current research topics include forgiveness, reconciliation, reparation, and apology, as well as the philosophy of Hannah Arendt. And I should also mention she's also recently co-edited a volume of essays on moral issues in the wake of violent conflict called Justice, Responsibility, and Reconciliation in the Wake of Conflict, which was just published with Springer, I think 2 months ago, roughly. January 1st, so very recently. So we'll follow our usual format. Professor Parekh will speak for about 30 to 35 minutes, and then we'll turn to comments by Professor MacLachlan, with a brief reply following, and then we'll leave the bulk of the time, as usual, roughly an hour, for discussion with all of you. So welcome.
So thank you very much. I want to thank my hosts for inviting me here. I'm actually from the area originally. I was born and raised in Hamilton and sort of went abroad to study, so it's great to be back in the area. So I'm going to talk today about the subject of a book project that I'm currently working on. And the paper is entitled Beyond the Ethics of Admission, Stateless People, Refugee Camps, and Moral Obligations. And the topic in general is about our moral obligations to people who are outside of not just our state, but outside of all states, who don't have either any formal citizenship or any effective citizenship, or at least have nobody who acknowledges that they are their members and therefore their obligation to take care. I'm sorry, I just want to keep an eye on the time so I don't go too much over. Everybody knows that refugees is a huge political problem, economic problem. You know, whose responsibility are they? Sending states, the states where refugees come from, the international community who has a formal obligation to look after them, you know, Western states who in principle are able to take in refugees. Economically speaking, who has an obligation to pay for refugee protection, relocation, admission. And then the political question is, of course, how should they be dealt with? Repatriation, resettlement, you know, more or less indefinite, you know, station outside of their country. Philosophically, and I'm a philosopher by training, the philosophical question, I think, is, you know, what are our moral obligations to refugees and stateless people over and above what we might owe them politically, economically, so on and so forth? So sort of bracketing the really difficult political questions, which is to say, you know, what would be the political consequence of admitting refugees or giving more resources to refugees? What are our bare bones moral obligations to refugees? And thinking about this sort of abstract question, I think, is a way to get at a basis for challenging existing, or perhaps supporting existing policies and norms about statelessness and refugees. So the problem, as I see it in a nutshell, is this. there are about 72 million people who are called forced migrants. And these are people who are forced to leave their countries for a whole host of reasons. It could be political persecution, it could be poverty, it could be environmental destruction, it could be war. So this number includes all people who leave their home countries by force. So which is to say it excludes economic migrants, as they're called, people who choose to leave their home countries to pursue a better life. Now, of these 72 million people, the vast majority are displaced for prolonged periods of time, which is to say 15 years or more, and sometimes permanently. So protracted refugee situations is the norm once you've been forced to leave your home country rather than the exception. Okay, so that's on the one hand. On the other hand, sovereign states guard their right to decide who will be admitted to their country. Some people think rightly, some people think wrongly, but almost no sovereign state will admit an obligation to let in stateless people or refugees, people who aren't their citizens. The US, for example, says that our refugee policy is entirely on an ex gratia basis, which is to say it should be interpreted as an act of our generosity and in no way be seen as the fulfillment of a moral or legal obligation. So the result is that approximately 1 in every 100 of the world's citizens live more or less permanently outside a state, and no state will acknowledge responsibility for them. So the question that I'm asking is, what, if anything, do we owe people in this situation, outside of all states and no state willing to acknowledge responsibility for them? And I want to note that I'm bracketing an important moral question here, which is to say that I'm bracketing the question of what the basis of our obligations to needy non-citizens are. And some people want to deny that we have any moral obligations to people. Others will want to deny that we have any moral obligations to people who are not our co-citizens. I'm starting from the perspective of human rights, which broadly says that all human beings have an intrinsic dignity that gives rise to basic fundamental rights. And therefore, if there's this general thing called human rights, then we have to think about the moral obligations we have to uphold them, not violate them, etc. So I'm at least bracketing that question that is perhaps even more foundational, and just going on the assumption that we do in fact have moral obligations to people just in virtue of their being human. So to answer the question, or what I will argue in my paper, is that we need to reframe the problem of statelessness and consequently rethink the obligations that our situation gives rise to. So what I'm going to do now is to sort of divide my paper into two parts. And in the first part, I'm going to give a critical analysis of contemporary philosophical accounts. And in the second part, I'm going to make a positive argument for how we should understand statelessness. In particular, I want to say that we should understand statelessness as entailing what I refer to as an ontological deprivation. And I'm going to be drawing on the work of Hannah Arendt to make this claim. The ontological deprivation says that there are certain harms that are done to human beings just in virtue of being citizenship, over and above the legal harm or the political harm of being denied citizenship. And ultimately what I want to say is that if we can separate these two kinds of harms, the sort of legal harm of citizenship and the other forms of harm that come with being permanently displaced, we may be able to address one kind of harm without necessarily the other. So in other words, we don't need to solve the whole thing and find a home for all refugees. We may be able to mitigate some of the worst forms of harm that are befalling refugees. So that's what I hope to do. Ultimately, the challenge will be to create the spaces and conditions where refugees and stateless people can be seen and heard, where their action and speech can gain meaning, so ultimately that we can see them as equal members of our common humanity, whether or not we also acknowledge them as citizens. All right, so of course, philosophers have for a long time talked about what's called the philosophy of immigration, which is to say, what are our moral obligations to let in people into our sovereign state who want to come in? And the moral justification for the closing of borders goes to the very heart of liberal political philosophy, which of course wants to maintain fundamental human equality as a principle, yet at the same time say that we can have justifiable reasons for excluding people, which is to say treating people as different than ourselves. So it's balancing equality with democracy, which of course is a very difficult thing. And many people, of course, have tried to make an argument for this, and there's a whole literature on immigration theory. And within this debate, most people acknowledge, not everyone, but most people acknowledge a distinction between immigration in general and refugees in particular, and acknowledge that the latter group have a stronger moral claim. Because, and this I think is due in a large part to Michael Walser's initial definition of refugees, and he said refugees are people who have the strong moral claim, and their claim is, if you do not let me in, I will be killed, which is very different from the claim of immigrants, which is that, oh, I'd like to come in because I think it would be very nice. So to say the claim of refugees, if you don't let me in, I will be killed, clearly there's a stronger moral weight there, at least within liberal political philosophy. And interestingly, Walser also defined refugees as people whose moral claims cannot be met by exporting wealth, but only by taking people in. So this is to say they're different from people who are impoverished, who you might say, well, we have obligations to them because they're needy non-citizens, and let's give 10% of our GDP to them or something like that. Well, refugees are not in a position to receive aid, and in fact, this is not even what they need most fundamentally. What they need is a home. So admissions to our country is the only way, he thinks, we can help refugees. And I should at this point make a clarification in the way that I'm using the term refugees and the way that it's sometimes used. The strict sense of the meaning of the word refugee is somebody who meets the UN definition of a refugee found in the UN Refugee Convention of 1951 and its 1967 protocol. And these are people who suffer individual persecution on the basis of one of 5 grounds: race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or social group, and have crossed a border. So it's a very narrow definition of what a refugee is. And of the 72 million, the number I gave you initially, only about 15 million are considered refugees. And interestingly enough, of those 15 million who are considered refugees and therefore eligible for resettlement, less than 1% are ever in fact resettled. By contrast, when I talk about stateless people, I mean all of those people who have been forcibly displaced and are without any form of political citizenship, effective citizenship, or political belonging, regardless of how they're classified legally. Refugees, asylum seekers, forcibly displaced, sans-papiers, internally displaced, war refugees, etc. And this is, again, about 72 million people. Originating in large part by Michael Walser's sort of pioneering work on the ethics of refugee admission, I argue that in philosophy, the ethics of admission has come to dominate the philosophical landscape. And in fact, if you look at philosophers as different as Joseph Cairns, as many of you know, and Heath Wellman, the one thing they agree on is that the question of admissions is the central ethical question. So consequently, it's been almost the exclusive focus of philosophers. The debate then is how to ground an obligation to refugees based on the urgency of their need, while simultaneously maintaining an ethical basis for closure. So people take different points on this. Michael Walser, I think, has the most middle-of-the-road position. He argues that the right to exclude is based on the importance of communities of character. So we have obligations to let in some refugees, but because of the value of communities get to decide how many and which refugees. Shayla Ben Habib, Joe Cairns, Peter Renata Singer, and a whole host of others think we have much more robust obligations to refugees, but not unrestricted. So all say that there's at least some limit at which we can say you can't come in. Wellman, on the other hand, says that states can legitimately close their borders to, quote, all potential immigrants, even refugees desperately seeking asylum from incompetent or corrupt political regimes. So this is a very interesting debate, of course, and I think very important because, of course, resettlement makes a huge difference in the lives of refugees who are resettled, and it's a wonderful thing. But I think this debate has been too narrow in its focus, and I think it's been too narrow for 2 primary reasons. First of all, it's only focused on one subset of stateless people, and these are the people who are deemed refugees and thus eligible for resettlement. And as I mentioned, this includes less than 1/5 of the people that I want to include in this larger group. Consequently, it renders normatively invisible the rest of stateless people, which is to say we focus on our moral obligations to this narrow group, And once we kind of come to that conclusion, we say, okay, well, we've done our theorizing about stateless people, and we can go on and focus on other things. And we never consider the question, what happens to people who we've justifiably excluded, and that all states feel that they've justifiably excluded? So the ethical questions around obligations to this group are never raised, let alone addressed. And secondly, I think the ethics of admission approach doesn't consider the unique harm that comes from living outside of all political communities. And interdisciplinary scholarly research on refugees, and what's sometimes referred to negatively as the refugee regime, has shown that there's a very distinct kind of harm that comes from the way we in fact treat refugees while they're in this limbo period. That is experienced as a form of domination and a very distinct form of harm. And again, because the focus is on this moment of admission, this treatment never gets called into question ethically. As Lesher puts it, the majority of the world's refugees are not offered permanent asylum or opportunity to integrate into local communities. Rather, they are kept separate and dependent on external existence provided by the international community. So the vast majority of people who are forcibly displaced are in the situation described by Jill Lesher. So my suggestion then is to broaden this debate, and the way I think we ought to do this is by turning to the work of Hannah Arendt. I think there are other ways you could do this, but this is the way that I think provides the most immediate entrance. So my thesis is that in order to develop a fuller set of moral norms around statelessness, we need a more nuanced understanding of statelessness in the contemporary world. And I suggest that statelessness has to be understood as entailing two fundamental harms that need to be understood and analyzed separately and distinctly. The first is the political and legal harm, and the second is what I've been calling the ontological harm. And this understanding of statelessness leads to a more robust analysis of ethical norms, because once we pull these two sets of harms apart, we can discuss separate ways of addressing them. And more importantly, the failure to address the political harm through resettlement, which we've of course failed to do historically, does not mean we can't also address the other form of harm. So Hannah Arendt, we'll turn first to the legal and political harm of statelessness. Hannah Arendt, as many of you know, was a 20th century philosopher. She was a Jewish woman who lived in Germany and fled, in 1939 to France, and then eventually went to America. And wrote a lot on totalitarianism, the Holocaust. Eichmann in Jerusalem is one of her sort of famous books. She criticized the Jewish community for its reaction to German authorities. And so she's very well known in this way. She was also one of the first people to address the legal harm of statelessness. So what happened when a person became stateless? And she said that once you become stateless, which is to say once you lose your citizenship, you become rightless, which is to say once you've lost the protection of your domestic law, you're without any other legal protection. And this, of course, struck many as being crazy, if not unfortunate, if not crazy, because this is what human rights were supposed to do. Right? Human rights were supposed to be the rights that kicked in, as it were, once you had lost all of your other rights. And what she observed was that, in fact, the opposite was the case, that once you lost your citizenship rights, you also lost your human rights, because human rights were not enforceable outside the boundaries of a political community. There's simply no one willing and able to guarantee human rights outside of your national state. Other states were not willing to do this. There was no international agency doing this at the time. So this claim comes from Arendt's 1948 book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, and there's one sort of chapter in particular that comes out of, and it's discussed a lot. And you might think, well, this was 1948, and so much has happened since. There have been so many legal developments around refugees and stateless people that are designed precisely to address Arendt's criticism. Most importantly, of course, is the 1950 Refugee Convention and the 67 Protocol, which took away the territorial restrictions. And there are numerous other sort of conventions and treaties and bodies of law around refugees and stateless people to try to protect their human rights once they are outside of a state. And yet the consensus of most scholars who examine this is that stateless people remain at best in a fundamentally precarious situation. And this is for the following reason. Few countries acknowledge robust moral obligations, which is to say acknowledge that we owe something to people who are stateless or refugees just because they're human beings. as I mentioned earlier, the US explicitly denies this. They wrote it into their 1980 Refugee Act to deny that there's any moral obligation that they're acknowledging. It simply must be understood as an act of generosity. The few obligations that are widely accepted, such as non-refoulement, as it's referred to, which is to say, if a refugee is on your territory, you have an obligation not to send them back, not to refoul them to their country of origin if they have a legitimate fear of persecution. This is something that in principle is widely acknowledged, yet in practice is widely ignored, it's widely violated, and more interestingly is the ways that states come up with getting around it, so to speak. So we were talking about some earlier at lunch, things like the externalization of borders, as this is sometimes referred to. So the border of Europe is not Europe anymore, but it's North Africa. So there are border controls in Africa that prevent people from migrating to Europe to then claim refugee and asylum status. So even though that's, of course, illegal, patrolling water so people can't cross over from international waters into your territory, of course this goes against the spirit of non-refoulement, but it's widely practiced by many countries in the world, particularly Western ones. And then finally, and I think perhaps most interestingly, in 1950, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees was created, and this was the UN body that was tasked specifically with the job of taking care of refugees, sort of protecting them in lieu of their states. And the general conclusion is that while the UNHCR can act as a kind of humanitarian organization, which is to say provide food and tents and things like that, they cannot provide for their political interests. And this is because of how things are divided structurally. The UNHCR works in the interests of the states that fund it, not in the interests of the people who they're supposed to protect. So the interest of states is, of course, to keep refugees segregated, not to be a political burden. This is not to say that individuals working within these institutions are not well-meaning, but structurally they've really failed to actually provide any kind of political support, political protection for refugees. So the conclusion is, for many, of course not all, but for many scholars, is that the legal and political situation of refugees is as fundamentally precarious as it was in 1948 when Arendt was writing. So the critique then, this is the political critique of statelessness that Arendt, as I mentioned, was one of the first people to notice. And what I suggest in my paper is that though this is the part of Arendt that's most talked about, it's not even her deepest critique of statelessness. As problematic as this is, for her this wasn't even the worst part of statelessness. Oh, and I forgot to mention, she herself was stateless for 19 years. So after leaving Germany, it was 19 years before she got US citizenship. So Arendt's insight, I want to claim, is true on the way that stateless people are treated, or remains true. And she says, quote, "The prolongation of their lives is due to charity and not to right, for no laws exist which could force the nations to feed them." So I think she's still right about that. So this is one kind of harm. The second kind of harm that Arendt draws our attention to is what I refer to as the ontological deprivation. In becoming stateless and losing your place in the common public world, a person loses something fundamental about their humanity, some of the most essential characteristics of human life, over and above citizenship and political rights. And this is to say, to be rendered stateless is to be neither fully human nor fully a citizen. And this entails three distinct elements, and I'll talk about these each in turn. A reduction to biological life, a separation from the common realm of humanity, as Arendt called it, and to be put in a form of abandonment, to use Giorgio Agamben's phrase, and a loss or a suspension of agency, or the ability to act. And then, of course, the last question I'll look at in the conclusion is that are there ways to rectify this kind of deprivation, even while stateless people remain formally excluded? So the first form of the ontological deprivation is this fundamental change in identity. So Arendt noticed that statelessness entails a transformation of identity that had two parts. So the first part was this loss of individual identity. And she said that of people who are refugees, the biggest problem, they say, is, quote, "Nobody here knows who I am." So all of a sudden you become a nothing, a nobody. All those things that were important to you in your individual life prior to being stateless are lost. You become nothing, a nobody, if you will. And this is replaced with a different identity, which is that of a human being in general, quote, "without a profession, without citizenship, without an opinion, without a deed by which to identify and specify himself." So you become a human being in general, bare life, and this is the term that Giorgio Agamben has sort of made famous, biological life, separated from a political or a social existence. And the problem with this is that unlike what the philosophers of the Enlightenment thought, being just a human being didn't give rise to awe or somehow reverential treatment, but quite the opposite. Quote, "The world found nothing sacred in the abstract nakedness of being human." So it seemed that the person who had lost their citizenship had actually lost the qualities by which it makes it possible for you to treat them as a fellow human being. So in other words, in becoming purely human and becoming this biological existence, it actually became harder to recognize people as human and therefore worthy of particular kinds of treatment, particularly kinds of good treatment. And so in the paper, I have another discussion about Agamben's development of this concept, and then I tie it into the work of a French anthropologist named Michel Agier, who noticed that the way that this manifests itself in refugee camps today. The criterion for humanitarian existence, if you are in a refugee camp and you want food, blankets, other kinds of material goods, is that you claim to be bare life, a human being, not a political subject, not a ethnic group. So you can make your demands on the basis of who you are, but merely on the basis of that you're a body needing care. So he writes that aid requires the social and political non-existence of the beneficiaries of aid. Because, of course, if you're a non-governmental organization, you can't be seen to be favoring one group over another or benefiting one ethnic group over another, one political section over another. You have to just treat people as human beings. So it sort of reifies this idea that we become human beings, that in refugee camps, this sort of bare life becomes that which you have to adopt, even if, of course, you don't want to, and as many people don't. The second kind of ontological deprivation, I think I'm just going to skim over so I can get to the third and I think most fundamental one. And this is the exile from the common realm, and this being this form of the inclusive exclusion, as Agamben calls it, this form of abandonment. And I can, of course, talk about that in the Q&A if you're interested. Now, the third ontological deprivation that Arendt says is that being reduced to bare life and being placed outside of the common realm of humanity means that statelessness transforms your ability to speak and act in a meaningful way. And this diminished sense of agency has to be understood in this Arendtian sense of what it means to act. And action for Arendt is very idiosyncratic. It's tantamount, it's equivalent to being free. She says to be free and to act are the same thing. And most importantly, action is intersubjective. It's not something you can do by yourself. In fact, it's something you do to distinguish yourself, to reveal your individuality, and therefore requires this kind of recognition from other people. So it's always intersubjective. It can never be done in isolation. Now, I want to stress that for Arendt, even though being stateless entailed a diminishment of your agency, she never claimed you wholly lost it. And in fact, one of the important things of her philosophy is that she gives us a reason for why we need to see it as being a fundamental human capacity, something that all people retain even in the worst circumstances. And this has to do with her understanding of natality, that human beings by definition are these creatures who begin, who start something anew. So it's always this latent human capacity. So for Arendt, because action is rooted in natality, it's never something that we can be wholly rid of. So in other words, it's a diminishment, but it's never fundamental, it's never absolute. Action, she says, requires two things in order to be meaningful. And these are the two things in particular that stateless people are deprived of. Namely, a public space that makes action more than a rare exception. And this public space is something about the publicness that entails also freedom of movement. You're free to move, you're free to act, you're free to create this kind of political engagement. And this, of course, is something that is not available if you are in a refugee camp, for example. And the ability to be judged as a speaking and acting being. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean you need an institutionalized public setting, not at all. She says it requires, quote, the space of appearance where you can be judged by word and deed, where you can manifest who you are as an individual and not merely what you are, those qualities that are given to us by virtue of birth, but who you are, what makes you distinct and unique as a human being. And the problem is that stateless people are no longer judged by their words and deeds, but they're judged by their bare life, by the fact that there are bodies to be cared for, indistinguishable from other suffering bodies. So fundamental is this that she claimed the most fundamental human right is the right to live in a framework where you are judged by your actions and opinions. And the deprivation of human rights ought to be understood as a manifest first and above all in the deprivation of a place in the world which makes opinions significant and action effective. So in sum, stateless people have a diminished capacity to act, and this is part of the ontological deprivation of statelessness. And though this capacity is diminished, it's never completely eliminated because it's rooted, at least in part, in the human condition of natality. So refugees and stateless people can speak and act in extreme conditions, but their speech and action is limited and doesn't have the impact it might because of these conditions that they're under. Namely, their words and actions aren't recognized by others in the outside world, particularly those with power, NGOs, other host governments, people in Western states. They're not judged by their words and deeds, but by what they are, right? Refugees, bodies to be cared for in need of protection. So the intersubjective recognition for their speech and action is absent. And refugees camps, of course, lack this durable space of appearance. In my paper, I talk about one example that Didier Fassin mentions in his extended work on statelessness. And this is the story of a woman named Marie, who in the mid-2000s was a Haitian refugee who was gang raped in Haiti in the context of political unrest and came to France with her boyfriend and claimed asylum status. And she was, of course, denied asylum because 97% of Haitians who claimed refugee status in France in that period were denied refugee status because they said, the gang rape was bad, but it wasn't political and therefore cannot be the basis of asylum. So she did what 85% of failed asylum seekers do, which is stay in the country that they claim asylum in and just live underground. So she became an illegal immigrant and gradually became sicker and sicker and more malnourished and gradually more unhealthy until finally her friends convinced her to see a doctor. And it turned out she, of course, had developed full-blown AIDS, as you might have guessed, as the result of this gang rape. Now, France has a very interesting clause in the refugee policy, which is the humanitarian exception, or there's another term for it, but basically, if you are so sick that being sent back to your home country, you wouldn't be able to receive treatment, you are allowed to stay. So she was ultimately given this humanitarian waiver and allowed to stay in the country. And Fassin uses this as an example of exactly what I'm talking about. Right? Her words were not believed. Her words were deemed meaningless. She was a liar, she was exaggerating, she wasn't giving the full story, the political context. But her body is what she was seen as. Okay, you are sick, you have AIDS, therefore, as this being, as this bodied being, we will accord you political rights. So her words, which had the capacity to determine whether she was going to be given asylum and therefore legitimate status and ultimately citizenship, political rights, the right to work, the right to participate, her words simply had no effect. They were not believed, they were not heard, they were not recognized in this way that Arendt describes. Her body, of course, was. Okay, so I have a little bit of time. So Arendt has been critiqued for a few reasons. The most obvious one that sometimes jumps out at people is that this is an exaggeration. Of course, refugees have agency. They act all the time. We think of the Interahamwe in Rwanda, Hamas in the Palestinian territory. People who work with refugees say, oh, this is not true. I know lots of refugees who enact meaningful lives in refugee camps. And, it's different and it's hard, but they find these ways of making meaning in their lives. And so I want to defend Arendt from this claim by saying that in a fundamental way she would agree with them. And again, I link this to her understanding of natality and the fact that this capacity to act and to begin is so fundamental to human beings that even in the worst situations, that even in refugee camps, even in totalitarian states, people find ways of acting. So I think Arendt isn't as extreme on this as some people think that she is. But what I want to say is that her philosophy is so useful because she's able to explain how we still have this deep harm that comes from being bare life, that comes from not being recognized by other people as a human being and having your words and actions recognized, but without denying that people lose agency altogether. So what Arendt emphasizes that I think is useful is that speech and action are important to distinguish ourselves not only from those who are close to us, who are like us, so within refugee camps that you have these small clusters of people working together and acting, but from to people who are different than us and unlike us, which is to say NGOs, the UNHCR, Western states, host states, their home states. And she says, without this kind of intersubjective recognition, your freedom of opinion, which of course you still have, it is a fool's freedom because it doesn't matter to anyone what you think. So there needs to be something more meaningful. So Arendt, I think, can explain why the loss of speech and action is a fundamental loss, but never absolute. And the problem with refugee camps is that action is not impossible, but they create the conditions in which this kind of meaningful life is as difficult as possible. And particularly that your action and speech won't be recognized from people who matter, right? NGOs, state governments, etc. And without a reliable space of appearance, you are judged not by your words and deeds, and even the ontological capacity of action is not sufficient to overcome this. So to conclude, what I want to suggest is that if we think of statelessness as having this ontological deprivation, this distinct kind of harm that philosophers, I think, really hadn't theorized before, we can think about different ways to mitigate it, even if we're not prepared to say, well, let's now admit 72 million refugees, which no state is. I mean, that's not even under consideration. For example, it would reframe how we think of more long-term encampment, which is the norm. This is the standard for treating refugees. Put them in a camp, put them outside of the geographically recognized world, don't put it on a map, don't talk about it, don't show pictures of it. Count them, but don't certainly treat them as individuals. That this way of treating 1 in every 100 people on Earth is not morally acceptable. Look, we might say pragmatically it's the only thing we can do. Politically, it's the only thing we can do without getting kicked out of office. Fine. My concern is to at least say, we might want to say that we have to do these things politically, but we must at least acknowledge that it's not morally acceptable to treat people like this. Secondly, the US and Canada as well, I'm sure, are large donors to the UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, and play a large role in shaping refugee policy globally, and of course the importance that's given to refugees in certain political situations. And I argue that we need to think about making refugee policy more consistent with moral norms. For example, we ought to insist on the human rights of refugees in camps. So in the UN Refugee Convention, they list that if people have to be put into camps, we must at least respect certain fundamental human rights, such as the right to earn wages, the right to basic education, the right to access to courts and travel documents, and the right to freedom of movement, which are not only routinely but fundamentally denied. These are not even discussed. And the fact that they're denied is never raised as a morally problematic in any way. And I think at least we ought to claim that it's morally problematic. At least there's something that ought to be done about it. And there are many refugee agencies that have proposed very creative solutions. So one that I think is very interesting is called temporary local integration. So instead of funding camps, which of course cost millions and millions of dollars, they would fund the integration of stateless people and refugees into countries where they are, and sort of fund education for the whole community. Fund jobs programs, fund co-op programs, so the money goes into the community in which these people are temporarily living until a permanent solution is found. But it would completely alter how people are seen, how people are understood, where resources go to, and again, how refugees are seen as human or not, and capable of citizenship, or worthy of citizenship, if you will. And I want to conclude the paper by saying this is, I don't have the answer, this is just a beginning, but I think if we understand statelessness in the way that I propose in my book, that we can begin talking about other kinds of solutions besides resettlement, which is still important and still needs to be talked about, but in a larger discussion with other options. So, thank you very much. 35 minutes.
All right. Thank you very much, Serena. In her presentation today, Serena Parekh has challenged us to reconceive our moral obligations to refugees, forced migrants, and stateless persons by expanding and deepening our understanding of the harms that befall those who fail to belong to a political community. We'll only be able to identify all our appropriate moral obligations, she argues, when we are capable of wholly and more entirely grasping the conditions of deprivation and harm that give rise to these obligations. In doing so, she encourages us, she pushes us as theorists to move past the normative debate that has framed almost all philosophical discussions of refugees, a debate she terms the ethics of admission. According to the ethics of admission, the central, and for practical and policy purposes, only real moral question provoked by the forced displacement and exclusion of large populations is whether and under what conditions a particular state has an obligation to admit them as members of that state's political community. Theorists can disagree over the nature and extent of a state's just membership conditions, but they tend to take the question of admission not only as a common starting point for discussions of refugees, but the remaining dominant area of concern. And so I think Parekh rightly critiques this normative framework for the narrowness of both its philosophical and its population scope. And the population scope is important here. The ethics of admission criteria, whether theorized broadly or narrowly, can only apply to those stateless people who are officially classified as refugees and eligible for resettlement. And it's important to notice that this isn't a contingent fact, it's a philosophical one. The ethics of admission the debate starts really from Michael Waltzer's definition of a refugee, which is defined in terms of the reason and urgency of admission. So you have a shift from talking about forced migration to talking about official refugees, which means we're already thinking only in terms of admission before we've even raised the moral question. But second, and equally significantly, Parekh argues that the ethics of admission characterizes the harm done to stateless persons too narrowly, construing it only as the legal political harm constituted by the loss of citizenship. So as a question of denied status, but not of denied or at least constrained human being, that is, constrained ways of fundamentally being human. It is only by turning to an alternative framework, namely Hannah Arendt's political theory, that we can properly understand what Parekh describes as the ontological deprivation facing the stateless. Once we appreciate the three distinct but interconnected elements of this deprivation, and I want to take a moment to just remind you of these, you have the reduction of personal identity to the merely human or bare life, the idea of being a body with needs. Second, the separation of stateless persons from the common realm of humanity. And Serena didn't have time to go into this in too much detail, but I want to highlight some of the manifestations of this because I think they're quite compelling. Enormous refugee camps that have existed for decades don't show up on maps of the world. They're just not there. There's something quite startling about literally not being on a map, even though these have populations as large as some countries and certainly have existed longer than some countries. They're also kept separate by purpose from the economic, social, and political life of the world. So in a refugee camp, your life goes on, the world goes on, but in a very real way, your life is kept separate from the world, is no longer part of the world. And that's not a lack of relationship, that's an actual relationship of exclusion. So your relationship to the world becomes being excluded from it, from the physical geographic representations of the world to the activity that constitutes our understanding of it. So you're a body with needs, you're excluded from the world, and from these, the subsequent diminishment of refugees' political agency, namely their ability to speak and act meaningfully. So these three aspects of the ontological deprivation, Parekh concludes, show us moral obligations that extend beyond and apart from the question of admission, namely obligations to mitigate these. So she's forcing us to think not just what does it mean not to be a citizen, but what does it mean to appear in the world as a humanitarian object rather than a political subject? In my comments today, I wish to highlight one significant strength I take to exist in Parekh's analysis, both with those concerned with the rights of refugees specifically, and those of us interested in broader questions of exclusion. And I want to raise two possible sources of concern for Parekh's approach. But I should begin by noting that I start from a very sympathetic place. I'm sympathetic to the motivating concern behind this work, and I'm also sympathetic, for the most part, to the turn to Hannah Arendt. So, and I think this is really why. Instead of taking for granted that the harm of statelessness turns entirely on the bestowal or denial of a certain status without interrogating that status, and thus keeping the notion of belonging that makes the status of citizenship so important, Parekh's Arendtian analysis allows us to understand what follows for us as human persons when that status is denied. That is, the significance of that denial to human ways of expressing and living our distinctive agency. She does so by tying the political more closely to what she calls the ontological, because it concerns ways of being, but what we might equally call the agential, ways of living out agency. Our political status as state citizens or stateless has fundamental implications for our existence as human persons, because it turns out quintessentially political conditions, so the existence of a stable public space that is politically secured and guaranteed for us to act in, and other agents that we are connected to, not as intimates, but as members of a political community, so people who are like us and also different. These political conditions turn out to be necessary conditions for quintessentially human action. So the human is more political and the political is more human than many of us realize. Now, many of us who are familiar with the material deprivations facing refugees, cramped spaces, inadequate dwellings, contaminated water, poor access to medicine and education, may nevertheless have failed to consider such ontological or agential deprivations, especially the importance of meaningful speech and action. We have failed to think about being a humanitarian object and not a political subject. Parekh's alternative lens draws out aspects of the broader picture that are too often overlooked: purposelessness, life in a vacuum, the idea of exclusion and disconnection. Now, in the case of refugees, this point may well be obvious, at least by the end of Serena's analysis. But I wonder if this approach is potentially useful for those who are excluded from political communities in less obvious ways. That is, those who are citizens who are nominally granted political membership through passports, but who are nevertheless treated as mere humanity or bodies to be cared for, and who relate to fellow members through an active relationship of exclusion. I think here of those in care, persons with severe physical or mental disabilities, the elderly, as well as persons in severe poverty whose political membership is defined in terms of their access to state benefits and their deservingness of these benefits only, and also incarcerated persons, persons in state prison complexes. It's interesting to note that in the case of these marginalized populations, as with refugees, the kind of demands that in principle we think of as a matter of justice or human rights, in practice and policy and in public opinion around them can quickly slide into being treated as ex gratia charity or generosity. So isn't it nice of us to do these things for them? So you have that same slide Arendt talks about, that even though these claims are described in terms of human rights, what is right or just, when they're put into policy, they're always described in terms of mere humanity needs and thus in terms of charity. These people are also likely to be stripped of individuality and treated as mere bodies, and through denial of access to and appearance in the shared public space of citizenship, are most likely to be denied opportunities to speak and act meaningfully, which in turn contributes to their ongoing dehumanization. In other words, the ontological deprivation identified here by Parekh may have broader applications. So I think that's something really powerful about this approach. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I do want to raise two sources of concern I have. So first, I think that Parekh has done a really good job of showing us of the failure of those engaged in the normative debate about refugees to so far move past the ethics of admission. But I wonder whether they necessarily lack the conceptual resources to do so. So is the normative political philosophical debate as incapable of incorporating the harm of ontological deprivation that Parekh presumes that they are? Could, for instance, more sustained interrogation of the good of citizenship, and thus the nature of political belonging, draw appropriate attention to the multiple harms befalling stateless persons, even before we shift to this Arendtian framework? After all, at least one person in the just membership debate, Shayla Ben-Habib, talks about good grounds for admission. And in doing so, she describes good grounds for admission as grounds that, quote, you would accept if you were in my situation and I was in yours. So what she's invoking here is a kind of imaginative, empathetic engagement. And that requires engaging with another person's way of being. Now, it seems kind of shocking to me that someone as insightful as Shayla Ben-Habib most of the time is, doesn't go on to then think more about a refugee's way of being and some of the deprivations involved in this. But it seems to me that what we have here is a failure to fully engage in the imaginative exercise of empathy. But this could be traced not to a narrowness of the normative framework, but a narrowness in how the question has been formed thus far. Theorists seem to be concerned with what a particular state ought to do, rather than the broader question of what ought to be done. And again, I can sort of see a motivation for this. Given the sort of widespread failure of states to accept responsibility, unless it's absolutely forced on them, I can kind of imagine why theorists have wanted to focus only on those responsibilities that can be pinned to particular states. But maybe the traditional normative framework, by expanding from what any given state ought to do to what ought to be done, can incorporate some of this. Now, so I wonder whether the Arendtian ontological language is necessary to capture the phenomenon at hand. And part of the reason I have for posing this question is I worry a little bit about what we might call Arendt's somatophobia. So one of the things that she's very careful to point out is when the world starts seeing people as merely bodies, as merely human, you don't have this sort of appeal to the sacredness of the human or a reverence for the human, but completely opposite, a distaste for the body. And I think Arendt is very good at pointing that out. But I also think in her own work, there is a real distaste for the body, for the merely human, for the material. And I worry that in using an Arendtian framework, we might accidentally reproduce some of that somatophobia. So that's my first concern. My second is shorter. And it pulls in a slightly different direction and is perhaps more practical than philosophical. Is there a danger that concentrating in the way that Parekh rightly invites us to do so, namely alleviating the ontological harms of statelessness without political admission, so through better human rights practices in camps, through temporary integration, and the various measures she suggested in the conclusion, if we start to alleviate these ontological harms, do we make the question of admission seem less urgent or less significant, thus allowing states to further shirk their obligations to admit, or at least frame their obligations to admit more in terms of charity and ex gratia policy rather than justice? So how do we expand the ethics of admission without accidentally displacing it, assuming that the good of political belonging through citizenship is indeed an important good in its own right? So those are my two questions. I look forward to hearing your thoughts on these matters, as well as the questions of the audience. And Serena, I want to thank you again for your paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice. So Serena, if you'd like to take a few minutes, just reply briefly.
Alice is really talented at reading people's work and being able to summarize it in such a careful and generous way. So thank you for that and for the thoughtful comments and questions you've given to me about this project. The initial question on whether the ontological deprivation can be used to talk about people internal to a state, I think is really interesting. And the last time I was reading The Origins of Totalitarianism, I noticed that Arendt talks about minorities and stateless people, and minorities are effectively stateless people within a country, and they have some similar features. So I mean, minorities understood in the way you would have in 1948. So it really is something to think about. Yeah. So I appreciate that. I think normative philosophy is perfectly capable of dealing with this question in its own terms. It's just that it hasn't because of the way it's framed things. So I think it could, and I think my work is a way for them to do that. But it's certainly not an absolute inability to. But I'd like to think a little bit more about the second point about connecting it to Arendt's dislike of the body. The final question I think is really interesting because I think, and it's a very legitimate concern, that if you're going to sort of take care of the smaller problems, maybe the bigger problem will get displaced and we won't think it's so bad anymore because we've sort of helped them feel good about themselves in their refugee camps. I think that quite the opposite would happen. First of all, I think already nobody thinks of refugees and stateless people as an urgent political question. I think everyone is able to defer it in various explicitly and implicitly. So I don't know that we could ignore it any more than we already do. But more importantly, I think that if somehow we were able to create frameworks in which refugees were able to be seen as full human beings, as individuals, I think it would be much harder to ignore their political demands and their political expressions, were they actually able to have a space and a voice in which to do this. And in fact, one of the reasons I think refugee camps work so well in keeping people out of the political debate is because there is no, we don't ever hear about refugees. And even, you know, I've talked to people who work with refugees who use their quote unquote voices in brochures. So they sort of pull out quotes from refugees to, you know, have this smiling, successful humanitarian work. And they're kind of aware that there's no space that refugees have for speaking or talking or being human in any distinctive way. And I can't help but thinking that if we were actually confronted by refugees as stateless people, as individuals, and given what they've gone through and their humanity, we would be more open to their political concerns. But it's speculation. Thank you.
Okay, great, thank you. So we'll now turn over to the audience and have you asked some questions?
There's two of these mics around passed around for questions, and there's one on that side and one over here.
Okay, perfect. So make sure if you're asking any questions, we can get you on tape. Not because we're projecting the sound in the room, obviously, but these are taped and posted online. So yes, one. Actually, there.
Oh. Yeah. Okay. Hi.
Just keep it on the table.
Thank you so much, Serena, and a very clear presentation. I have a question about the last point that the two of you were bringing up, because I wonder if you can go even further and say that you're what you're doing here is not just giving the stateless people space, but you're actually also appealing to our moral sensibilities. And I just wanted to ask you if you think that there is any kind of political power in that to make politicians more responsible for these people.
I think that goes along with it. I mean, for around, you know, if I was going to answer for Arendt, speech and action, I mean, that is what power is, she thinks. People acting together, sort of disclosing their beings, working together to generate this kind of, I mean, to her, that's what political power is, in fact. I think so. I mean, I think that would be at least a start, and I think, of course, politicians and states and people within states would want to resist that and defer it and ignore it as best as they possibly could. But I think if it's going to come from anywhere, it's going to come from that. Exactly, rather than from the outside, from people saying, let's give them more rights, or outside groups saying, let's advocate for them. For it to come from within would, I think, be the strongest way for it to do that. Thank you.
Okay, next we have Danny.
Thanks. So maybe it's the empiricist in me, but I don't buy this story, I must say. And in fact, one fact that you mentioned is my best example. Hannah Arendt. You said she was 19 years stateless, and yet her voice was heard. It's still heard today. I can think of other people who are not necessarily stateless, but live in a community or in a country where they're not citizens, and they're definitely heard. So you try to address this, and then I thought, so the reason why stateless people have a problem is that many times they're poor, and it's bad to be poor for many reasons that are, including your chance of being heard, including your chance of getting the tools like education to make yourself heard. But the very fact that you are stateless does not, I don't see, and as I said, Hannah Arendt is sort of my exhibit A for being mere human, for being treated as mere body, for not being heard, for not, so I would kind of be, just want to say the problem with stateless people many times is they're simply poor.
You know, that's an excellent question, and I think as Alice pointed out, the sort of ontological deprivation can apply to other things as well. I think global poverty is certainly a prime case for that. It's a great question, and somebody had asked me this, that I had read this paper and said the same thing, like, if you or I became stateless, like, we wouldn't be voiceless, would we? We would be heard, and so isn't it a question of poverty rather than status? And at the very same day, I had read this quote from somebody who had been working with this refugee population, who had said something like, I went there thinking they were just going to be these sort of amorphous people, and I was astonished to realize they were doctors, they were lawyers, it was a journalist who had worked with people sort of fleeing different areas. And so they had come from all different socioeconomic backgrounds, all different kinds of educational levels. There were women, there were old people, there were young people, people we don't usually think of as these quintessential refugees. And it occurred to me, it's an empirical question, I suppose, but I think it doesn't necessarily have to do with poverty. I think it has to do with the fact that once you are in this situation, regardless of your wealth, it becomes meaningless because, of course, you can't have access to it. You don't have, the things that go along to it that give you status when you are in your political community. So I mean, it's certainly part of it, and I think poverty certainly diminishes your capacity to speak and act for many of the same reasons that I think statelessness does. But there is something about statelessness that I think has the same effect. And again, I don't it's not that everybody has this capacity, loses this capacity in an absolute way. And Arendt was always an elite. I mean, she had the gymnasium education. She was a student of Heidegger's and Jasper's. She had these connections. She had connections. She got one of the very few transit visas from France to the U.S. When she was in the U.S., she was immediately absorbed into a community. She immediately started working at the university level. So I think she's maybe not quite an essential example of stateless people.
Can I add something?
Yeah, go ahead.
And this might tie into your frustration with how the debate gets defined in terms of refugee, because it seems like what you're doing is interrogating the notion of stateless so that it's not just about a political status. Because there's a very different thing from being someone who has a job at the University of Chicago, although your citizenship is still getting worked out, and someone in a refugee camp. And I feel like your sort of emphasis to try and draw us away from relationship to current admission status and think more about certain ways of being and kinds of life. So, Arendt has a voice now, and after her death, and had a voice very quickly. But it's not clear in her transition from Germany to the U.S. that at every point she had a voice, and had she gotten stuck in a camp, which she was in for a very short time, the story might be very different.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, she had this tale of escaping from an internment camp very daringly.
Okay, I don't know your name, sorry.
I really like this discussion, especially drawing in Arendt and the questions of statelessness. I especially liked Alice's question, the first one, about whether or not we can apply it on a broader terms to exclusion within the community, because there's within Canada, within the Canadian context, within Torontonian context, a few days ago, Toronto just signed a policy that allowed access without fear.
Yeah,
I'm sure people here are familiar with that. But what that shows is also that it was a response to people not being able to, stateless people not being able to access basic services, basic humanitarian services without fear of deportation. Especially, I look at things from a disability context, and I also look at immigration law and the Canadian human rights policies. And I noticed that people with disabilities are often excluded, refused admissions into Canadian civil society. But not only that, but people who are here on work visas, or they become illegal citizens or illegal stateless people upon gaining disability, because of our excessive demand policies, and hence they are often deported.
Can you say what that is? I'm not familiar with that.
Excessive demand, and citizen and in the IRPA, Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, Section 38.1c is the excessive demands clause. What it says is that people can be excluded or from refused immigration or refused entrance into the country on the idea that their bodies will cause excessive demands on the Canadian health system. Often these are people with disabilities. These are people who are more elderly. And this law is above the Family Reunification Act.
It's above the
It is. And the thing is, what it creates is a lot of people with disabilities are in a constant state of statelessness. And combined with Section 40 of the Canadian Human Rights Act, which states that only people who are legally in Canada can claim human rights, then basically the state is legally allowed to discriminate against persons with disabilities because of disabilities, not because of anything else. So I was wondering if I could draw in, if your points could be drawn from Arendt into that.
Yeah,
into
absolutely.
exclusion on a
That's
broader
fascinating.
context.
I was not aware of any of that, and I'm going to ask you for more information about this, because this is, I mean, I think this is exactly what she's talking about, right? So only people legally in Canada are entitled to claim human rights. Supposedly they're supposed to be the rights that everybody has, but in fact they're the rights that you have by the virtue of your status, right, your legality, which is not how it was initially intended, and it's not certainly the language that's used when we talk about this as intrinsic dignity and intrinsic rights that you carry with you at all times. That was exactly her critique of human rights and citizenship. And the excessive demand clause is really fascinating because I think it stresses the extent to which people who want entrance are seen as bodies, as not as individuals, but the weight of their bodies is given the sort of bears the political weight.
The most interesting thing you mentioned charitable. The only way that, and humanitarian grounds, with the example of the Haitian woman in France, the only way that persons can overcome the excessive demands clause is through humanitarian grounds, a special appeal to the Ministry of Citizenship. So I just felt like this really draws it in and also contextualizes in what's happening in Canada right now.
It's like it's writing the script of exactly this sort of framework, the theoretical framework for what's going on.
So my actual question, sorry.
That's okay. This is great.
My actual question was, how can your theory be applied to human rights enforcement within Canada? For example, there's an organization here at York, Disability Rights Promotion International. Their job is to monitor disability rights in Canada. But oftentimes I've seen from their reports that they don't take statelessness into consideration. And in this, it creates this hierarchy of rights, I feel like. And I was wondering how your theory could be applied to address this.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Just off the top of my head, I would say that what I think Arendt is able to do is help us to point out why this is harmful, why this shouldn't just be the status quo because it's sort of politically efficacious and it flows from the normal ways we think about states, but is in fact wrong and harmful to people who are in this situation in ways that it might not appear to be, aside from people who are studying this and interested in working on it and sort of sensitive to the exclusions that are going on. So I think it could be a framework that could be used to talk about exactly what's problematic with the ways of defining people as bodies and putting disability within these categories. Fascinating. Thank you.
Stephanie?
Thanks. Thank you for the paper, and this conversation was very interesting to me. I have one quick point of clarification and 3 questions, but it won't take very long, I promise. The first is just about Agamben. Someone's got to talk about it. So I think that we have to be careful that Agamben wasn't talking about bodies that become needy. He's talking about bodies that can be killed without impunity. And that basically the refugee camp is, in a way, the killing of the body without the death. So as opposed to like the gradual deterioration and then allowing for rights. So most people in refugee camps don't actually gain humanitarian and compassionate grounds afterwards. And that was, I think, his point too, is that when you start to die politically, it doesn't really matter. And that this is the awful injustice of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
As opposed to just getting really sick and then through your sickness proving your humanity and then gaining rights. I mean, I think it's a more optimistic way of reading. the state of exception.
And an exceptional
Yeah.
thing, absolutely. Yeah, I didn't mean to sort of generalize about that.
Yeah.
But you're right, that's
Yeah.
exactly what the problem is, that you die without it mattering.
Yeah, and I mean, I think also in your paper you specify that a gambang goes a little bit too far with this, but just I think it's interesting about the sort of the casting away of the dead in a living sense. And then my 3 implications were, I just think we have to be a little bit more careful about statelessness and refugees, and sort of the illegalization of people, which I think is more to your point and to Danny's point, which is that when you come into a country legally and then you can't meet the criteria, or you work when you don't have authorization, you're not stateless. You've just been made to be in violation of the immigration rules. And that this is sort of a different context and a different theoretical idea than stateless people or refugees who have nowhere to go back to. And I think also if we put them together, we sort of hide the power of the receiving state. Because the receiving state is the one who decides that it's not okay for certain refugees to work, or it's not okay to get into a bar fight, even though you've been living in the state for 15 years. It's going to another one of these silly examples. So I really take your point about expanding to statelessness, but at the same time, we don't want to have the danger of becoming a catch-all kind of phrase for any migrant who doesn't tick a box, I guess.
Okay.
And then my second point is more like I was just wondering what people thought was that you talk in the paper too about how to make the conditions better in camps. And I just wonder if this is going to perpetuate the existence of camps, like sort of going back to Alice's point. And then it's also offloading the burden. And it's not really fair, I think. Like, it's not actually a discharging of the responsibility of states in power who often cause the refugee situations themselves by just saying, oh, we'll give you a bit more money and you have to continuously host people. Like, it's the warehousing critique again. And while I don't think it's correct that people live in refugee camps in dismal conditions, that's definitely wrong, I don't know if the answer is necessarily to just ask states to increase the conditions without kind of taking more of the responsibility for what caused the refugee movement to begin. But then I also have this other problem where I like your idea about local integration. However, there's a societal membership issue, which is basically that if you live in a community, you begin to grow relationships, and these relationships and connections have moral value. And then if you're going to be severed from those relationships, that's a moral harm. So if you can't live in a camp and you can't live outside a camp, temporarily outside a camp, like you can't ask somebody to live for, I mean, you didn't specify how long it would be, and I think that maybe would go to a bit of the question, but if you're living in a temporary local integration situation, that could, as we know, be meant to be a year, but wind up being 15, 20, 30 years. And then all of a sudden this person's being told that, oh, it was only temporary to begin with, so your relationships and all of this time and membership that you put in is now worthless. So, I mean, I think it's very complicated, but I was just wondering what you thought about that.
Yeah, thank you so much. Those are all really great, insightful points. So the temporary local integration is not my idea. It comes from, I'm forgetting the name of the source, but it's a refugee advocacy group who's trying to think alternatives to warehousing. And that I think the idea that, well, you have these ties that develop over time and severing them is a moral harm. You're absolutely right. In sort of a question of, well, which is the worst harm, to actually have those 30 years spent in communities where you're developing ties, or to have them never have ties in the first place and never be allowed to sort of make these connections to things. And I think the problem with the refugee situation is that the temporariness, the emergenciness of it happens, and then it solidifies. Yeah. And it seems like, from the point of view of a refugee, it would be better to do that while you are functionally living in, with some kind of political integration and social integration. But to the complexity deficit, absolutely. I mean, it's not a solution. It's not a perfect solution. It's an attempt to avoid what's been called the fourth permanent solution, the void, which is the warehouse, the refugee camp. So we have these three, repatriation, resettlement, and repatriation, resettlement, and is that? Integration. Thank you very much. So as the solutions to the refugee crisis. And what ends up happening for the vast majority of people is this fourth situation of the void, where you're just in a camp, or you're displaced within cities without any kind of political, you're not even registered with the UNHCR or anything like that. So as opposed to that fourth, there might be other ways of thinking creatively about alternatives. And I think there can be good and bad things about it, but at least to start thinking about that and to recognize that these other three solutions nobody wants. Nobody's even trying for these. And that this fourth solution ought not to be the default solution.
And if I could just say one thing too.
Yeah, sure.
And also, it would be a cheaper solution, right? Like it would
That's
cost
the
a lot
idea.
less money.
That's the idea. Yeah.
I mean, 'cause
exactly.
the same debate is going on around alternatives to immigration detention, which has a lot of similarities to refugee camps,
Yeah.
which is that you can have community supervision programs, but there the assumption is that it's always temporary and you will get out of the supervision program, whereas with the local integration, it's a little bit. That's why I think the time
Yeah.
element is so important. And,
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And whether states would think of that as being positive or not, so
Yeah.
they're getting this funding, and why would we want to give that up if and give these people
Keep
another
labor
home
force.
or something like that? Yeah. So there's certainly problems with it, and it's not great. And I completely agree that time is morally significant, and the longer you're in a place, the stronger claims you can make to a place. But I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing from the point of view of refugees and stateless people. So I think the question of responsibility for refugees is a huge issue, but I just don't. And I guess I just disagree that. Let me back up. I don't mean to suggest that we're trying to make the camps better in terms of like nicer meals and better places to live and things like that. What I suggest is a fuller understanding of political rights and agencies and ways of making refugees and stateless people live a kind of political existence, a fully human existence in the Sorrentian language. It may or may not be accompanied by better material conditions. And I think it's certainly linked to the question of responsibility for refugees, but it just seems to me that the more political agents, the more full human beings you're dealing with, the more people are seen as agents, the harder it is to ignore them and to not want to think about responsibility. It's such a hard question, and sending the states that are responsible for it are the ones that are least likely to take responsibility for it, and so the question of responsibility is an almost impossible. Like it's the most intractable question, I think. Which is why, I'm trying to think of ways that we can not necessarily be crushed by the fact that we can't answer that question, and think about other ways from the point of view, like as Alice put it, like what ought to be done for stateless people, even if we can't answer these really extremely important questions, but politically impossible questions to understand. And then your first question is an excellent one. I think that refugees are defined too narrowly, and I mean by stateless people who are without effective citizenship. So you're right to say that I shouldn't be too flip about just including various migrants in different statuses. I mean, there are some people who want to claim refugee status and have no citizenship back home and are not given refugee status and live illegally, and they would, I think, fall legitimately under my understanding of statelessness. But you're absolutely right to say that not all migrants would, and I should be more careful about that. Thank you, that's great.
Okay, next we have Cyrus. Do we have another microphone? Yes. So we go here and then.
Do you want to pass this down as well?
Yes.
Thanks, Mike. First of all, thanks. I enjoyed a lot. If I got it well, it means the problems of refugee and stateless are related directly to the states. At the same time, you expect the states regulates this because it's the first actors. To be honest, it's like to ask a rapist to regulate rape. When rape, who rapes, and how. Because this problem, I think, are related most specifically war. And who makes war? Not me, not you, the states, right? We have many conventions about torture, about do not, for example, use unconventional weapons. But we have a lot of problem about what do you mean by conventional weapon. But in this case, how do you expect? They are themselves the source of problems. Just how they can manage this problem? Because always we have army, and always we have wars, and unfortunately always we have a refugee people. I do not think it's this because it's systematic problems. So how you can expect the statesman, far from my living my daily life, expect they do something for refugees because they are not in this situation. First, secondly, they don't care, and thirdly, because there is some industry because of war. Everywhere is the same problem. How we can expect them to solve the problem when they are themselves criminals?
Yeah. Maybe I could hear you back.
Sorry.
Thank you very much. I mean, you're right. It's a very, very extremely difficult problem. A couple of things occur to me. So, war refugees. It seems like there are a lot of them, and there are, of course, but they're not the biggest group of refugees. In fact, the Red Cross, which is the group that studies migration, forced migration patterns, the biggest group is actually, well, certainly environmental refugees and people whose habitat has been altered by development. Those are the two largest, most growing groups. Which is odd because we almost never talk about environmental refugees and refugees who are made such because of development. So it's a huge problem, but it's not the only factor in talking about exclusion. And in terms of war, I mean, you're right. States cause wars, and states are the ones who are dealing with wars, and they are the ones who are perpetuating these things. But I still think states could take responsibility. When the U.S. launched the invasion in Iraq, everybody knew there would be refugees would be a known outcome of that, and that was not even part of their planning. So as a result, Jordan, Syria, Iran ended up having to deal with these huge refugee influxes with great resentment to the U.S., who had no way of planning for them, no resources allocated towards them, either financial or just in terms of aid and other ways. And I think that's, if there were more of an outcry for people in this situation, I think that would have been something.
Sorry for that, because I was born in Iran. I know very well that government cheats on UN Foundation because they pay for refugees. That government ups.
Yeah, that's another big problem.
Things because they are Afghan people and they are not Persian.
Yeah.
Racism or government.
And a complete injustice, of course. The European Union, after sort of praising the Arab Spring and talking about how wonderful this was and this move to democracy, the second thing they did after that was to start policing the waters to prevent people from coming into Europe from North Africa. So it's a very mixed relationship states have, and hopefully if what I'm saying is correct, that this is wrong, this is a real harm that's being done to people, and that we ought to reject as being politically neutral and certainly morally neutral. But you're absolutely right to point out the kind of complexity of the relationship between refugees and states, and of course corruption, poverty, dysfunctional governments, and all the other factors.
I'm sorry, I don't know the words. Even I want to be a stateless. No state allows me to be a stateless. I cannot travel, I cannot work. So I wanted to act, I want to claim this such as right, but I have no such a right to be stateless.
Yeah. Thank you.
In the back left corner.
No messages.
Oh, thanks.
I want to say good afternoon to the panel and good afternoon to everyone here. One of my questions, I have a couple, but it has to do with the responsibilities and the rights that were mentioned on behalf of the refugees and the states that were asking to host and
Could you speak up just a little bit?
yeah, the states that were asking to host these refugees and the commitments from the refugees themselves. I take it from the perspective of, say, the Minister of Immigration in Canada, for example. When we permit immigrants to come to Canada and to assimilate, we set out certain recommendations and expectations from them, and they have of us. With respect to, for example, say religion, these immigrants, we ask them to retain their identity, but we want them to assimilate. The evidence has shown over a long period of time, even second, third generation Canadians, once they grew up in immigrant households, they don't assimilate 100% because they have to keep it fluid because they have one identity within the household amongst the parents and relatives and one outside for the external Canadian society within which they're acclimatizing and adapting to. When you look at it from that perspective, if an refugee requests asylum in Canada, and whereas an immigrant, for them it's voluntary to want to come into Canada and to become part of the society and have a better economic life or political life or religious life, the refugee is being forced. So if they're being forced to give up, whether it's their religion or their political persuasion, we can't expect them to give that up when it comes to assimilation, and they may refuse to do that. It's the issue about comfort. Again, if someone's not comfortable with you, they're not going to trust you. That works both ways for the refugee and for us, because the ontological argument that you made when you said the human aspect about them losing their identity, the inclusion-exclusion aspect, they may be the ones too that are self-excluding themselves, because even though they want to become a part of the society to escape whether it's persecution, what have you, they retain certain things that in their eyes are distinct and separate from you, the host nation. So it becomes very difficult in terms of bridging that gap in communicating. And the point was raised about the same thing applies to minorities or immigrants. Within the society, you may be, your spirit, as she pointed out, within the refugee camps, you may live there, but your spirit may be, I heard this term from a movie I watched, Scent of a Woman. The worst thing is to have someone's soul, spirit being executed. Because once the spirit is amputated, everything else is meaningless. The initiative, the ability to think, to participate, the agency is gone. Because it's like that soul that you have has just been rendered from you entirely, and the existence is just listless. So I think it's a complex situation from the religious aspect, the socioeconomic aspect, and even the political aspect. So you've done great work, and with regards to the legal aspect internationally, we have a professor here at York, a pretty good professor, Ritu Mathur. She works with contemporary security policy, and she was doing some work with regards to humanitarian practices in terms of arms and disarmament. Because when we talk about these countries, we have to go back to the origin and the causes of what precipitated a lot of these events that induced these individuals to become stateless and to become refugees. We want to also ask countries that, we hope are inclined to accept these individuals, but also to see the root cause of the problem and to try to bring remedies to that, the solutions, as it were, instead of focusing on just the problems. Because that will bring us results. If we focus on that, that will bring us results. And I think it's very complicated that a lot of the countries that are involved, for example, use the UN, who are selling arms, are countries like the United States, Israel, who are selling weapons to Iran and vice versa. And they're pointing fingers to say, well, we want Iran to be eliminated while they're selling weapons and to Iran. And they're not going to stop because the money that they need to govern, it's a big, very big deal. So economically, the challenge for them, when they say, well, we want everyone else around the table to accede to the proposal of the International Committee of the Red Cross and the International Court of Justice, is that they, by doing that, eventually lose credibility. Because the lesser countries say, well, you want us to do this, but you're not going to do that because you have the weapons and you're selling it to us. The same thing with the nuclear weapons issue. So it's a fascinating thing in terms of how refugees get introduced into that argument, because it does have an impact in terms of like landmines and these weapons, what they affect. So the effect is pretty broad and comprehensive. So I think if you could also look at that as well, that would be very helpful, I think, over time.
Thank you very much for that. I mean, that's very thoughtful, and you raised a lot of points. And And look, you're right. I mean, the previous question as well. I mean, these situations are so complex, and I guess my way of approaching them is to try to think about it like this. If these questions are so complex that they can't be solved, that the only thing we can do is sort of, trade numbers, you take in 10, I take in 15,000, whatever, I almost feel like the situation is too complex to try to solve it in a root and branch kind of way, to really get at the root, get at the problem, see who's selling arms, see what the problem is, and then try to pin responsibility on them. I just don't think we're going to get very far politically that way, which is why my solution is just to look at this harm and look at these other more, if you will, superficial means of trying to address the problem without trying to address its root cause. I agree with you. It would be great if we could do that. And we haven't been able to do that. We haven't historically wanted to do that or tried to do that in any meaningful way. And the consequences that people end up living in these situations for, such a long period of time in these hopeless ways, that I think at least we can do something about it, even if it's not solve it all together. And your points about assimilation and immigration, that's, those are very interesting as well, and I need to think a little bit more about that. So I was raised in Canada, and I live in the U.S. now, and I always had that cliche, Canada is the cultural mosaic, and the U.S. is the melting pot. So I always had more the impression that Canadians were able to maintain their identities, their cultural identities in a way, and were encouraged to do so in a way that is much more than in the States, where you're very much encouraged to immediately be American and give up your language and give up your name and take on this persona of being American in a way that I find is less so in Canada. But, again, that's just my immediate perception. So thank you for that.
So we had a question.
Hi there. Thank you very much. I just wanted to sort of touch back on something that Fiona brought up with the access without fear. And there's, we live in this wonderful, what we tout as this wonderful multicultural metropolis here in Toronto. And it's the archetype of the mosaic that you mentioned. If I know you wanted to bracket the political debate, but it's not really something that you can ignore, I don't think. And if you want an example of the way the political debate plays out, you can just look to, and the way it plays out sometimes rather absurdly, you can look to Toronto City Council and see how this is sort of played out in the past week or so with respect to access without fear. And what I was sort of remembering was this. Minion Wong came out and he said his famous quotation was, "Well, their first stop will be the welfare offices because this is where they've been told to go back home," and that's it's an example of the way that the debate gets framed sort of absurdly. But this is happening in Toronto. It's happening right now, and what I think that idea of NIMBYism is that we can't afford this type of policy. What I think it sort of is informed by is something that's not necessarily a horrible thing, which is in Western society, which is a robust idea of what it means to be a citizen. And I think that what is sort of undergirding all that is that relaxed policies or policies such as access without fear will undermine what it means to be a citizen and undermine not only our rights that we get from citizens, but our duties as citizens in a Western liberal world. So I was wondering if your work here can answer those sort of critiques that are, going to be popping up. They pop up all the time.
Terrific question. Yeah. I'll just grab that. Yeah, thank you very much for that great question. So the access without fear. This is the idea of the sanctuary city.
Yeah,
is that right?
That we can allow really free, open access to healthcare.
Yeah, without asking for
without asking
status.
for ID, without asking for people people to identify themselves.
Yeah. You know, I was reading about this last week in the Canadian newspapers, and they never pointed out that there are actually 26 cities in the U.S. that do that as well, and that have done that for a long period of time. And, you know, in the U.S., this is even more amplified because we don't even want to give resources to citizens in the U.S., let alone foreigners and illegals, as we sometimes call them. So it's a very, so in a certain way you can trivialize it, but there's a way in which you point out that this is a very legitimate question. Democracies have a right to decide on the extent to which you're going to provide benefits and goods to people. And this is, in fact, what the very definition of democracy is and what citizenship is. And if it's nothing else, it is getting to say who can be a citizen and who cannot. This is the debate I alluded to earlier about immigration, and this is exactly the moral debate behind immigration. So we want to maintain this idea that everyone is free and equal, and yet as citizens we have a right to exclude certain people based on criteria that we ourselves generate, that we ourselves decide on, and it's really very difficult. And so in a certain way, if what we're saying is that, you know, the human rights of refugees trump democratic considerations, you know, it's a big claim, and I think people will object to that a lot. I think it's slightly different than saying that all immigrants have certain rights to be in a country, to say that, you know, refugees have a certain make certain moral claims on us that require us to assist them in these certain ways. I think it's a little bit different, but of course there's always going to be that criticism, and then the sort of financial criticism that you know, we can't afford it, this will undermine our you know, the whole system of resources that we have, etc. And I guess these are very important political questions, and I don't think we can solve them. I certainly don't think there's any easy way to solve them. But my way of approaching it is to think about, you know, just what's morally right. And if we want to say, look, politically, economically, we can't afford to give resources to people who are here illegally. Okay. That may be fine or may not be fine, but all I want to say is to acknowledge that that might not be morally correct. And certainly when it comes to refugees, I want to specify that the certain ways that we've been treating them may be politically necessary, economically necessary, but aren't at least morally right. And I think this at least gives us a basis to criticize things like what Fiona mentioned and other statutes, which are often justified as being morally correct, as well as being politically and economically sound. And I want to at least create a framework wherein which you can say, actually, there's a reason to think that this isn't the best way to think about it, at least the most moral way to think about it, whatever its conditions politically. Thanks.
So first of all, I just want to say thank you. I really enjoyed both the paper and the presentation, so thank you. I think the question of having to reshape the moral obligations that are owed to those who are stateless, we can imagine how that might play out on the institutional or the status level, but I think it's less clear how it would play out on an individual level. And you mentioned in your paper the idea of us having an interest as individuals who are members of this global community that presumably has an interest in human rights. So I'm wondering how, if at all, you would see status responsibility as giving rise to individual responsibility or collective responsibility for that matter, if we want to think about groups of individuals, either by virtue of our membership in a particular state that's especially well positioned to lead this project of reshaping, or by virtue of our membership in the sort of greater global community.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. It's a terrific question. I do think that there's a certain way in which we put too much emphasis on the idea that it's states' responsibilities, and certainly in Western democratic states, like the states are the people. So there's a way in which at least there's a direct connection between individual responsibilities or collective individual responsibilities insofar as we are citizens of a state and have obligations to think about the ways that our resources are spent, our policies are being furthered in our name, and things like that. So to that extent, I think it's all of our responsibilities to think about these global issues and to think about the ways in which our states, Canada, the US, or whatever, support robust positive moral policies, or the opposite? And if the opposite, then at least to recognize it, call it as such. If not, be more politically engaged to try to change it. Because look, states do what they think people want to do will get them elected, that is popular. And if it's clear that people find some practice morally reprehensible, morally unstable, morally illegitimate, it could at least potentially affect their ways of thinking about things. Maybe I'm too naive in thinking about it like that, but that's how I see the relationship between the individual, particularly within states that have robust democratic structures. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much again for that talk. So my question actually has to deal with sort of the move you made at the beginning, which was to separate the sort of political legal issue from the ontological deprivation issue. And I actually think that's a really interesting track to take. But my question is, at some point they're going to have to come back together, right? Because these are rather tangled issues. So I was wondering if you could maybe speak to the mechanics of that, sort of following the last two questions, and to just, so if we come to an appreciation of this ontological deprivation, my fear is then there's like, well, and then what, almost? And so do you have an account of sort of from there to where?
Thank you. Oh, just a little one. Thanks very much. Yeah, great, terrific question. I guess the way I envisioned it is that these are two sort of separate problems that we work on politically. And I think the question of citizenship and integration and resettlement is difficult, politically loaded, and has historically been something we've been unable to address. Sort of a quagmire, if you will, that's not really going anywhere. The ontological deprivation, I think, we've never tried to address it, and I think we could by making sort of policy changes that don't fundamentally alter our refugee policy, our existence, and so on and so forth. It would change refugee policy, funding mechanisms, but not fundamentally alter the status quo of things. But it seemed to me that if this were to occur and people were able to be, stateless people, refugees were able to be seen as political agents, their claims were heard, their voices and narratives became part of the political discourse, I think we might be able to get out of that quagmire, or at least there'd be more of an impetus and more of a drive to do that, to think about resettlement, to think about repatriation, to think about the ways in which the claims of refugees ought to be a legitimate and distinct part of our foreign policy. Even if it's not, they're not our citizens, they're citizens of somewhere else, but to have these sort of moral concerns as things that are worked out when we deal with development aid, trade policy, and so on and so forth in the ways that we do with other states. Thanks.
I might use my powers to and ask a question. I was curious about whether what your thoughts were on Hallis's observation that it's not just stateless non-citizens who experience ontological deprivation, but also people within states, so citizens who, for any number of reasons, don't have the kind of public voice or intersubjective recognition from others that they need for agency, or lose some of their many rights by not being able to exercise them or not having the legal rights within their own community. And so Alice pointed that out as being a strength of your account. It actually, we use Arendt's idea of ontological deprivation. We can then explain its existence in many other aspects, not just for stateless persons, but also for citizens, some citizens in some states. And I thought I wasn't sure whether you'd agree, yes, that's a strength of the account because it captures this much broader range of people who might suffer from ontological deprivation, or whether you might want to say, yeah, that's true, but we still need to focus on the moral uniqueness or distinctiveness of refugees. Otherwise, it's not going to be a paper anymore about refugees. It's going to be a paper about anybody who's suffering the harms of ontological deprivation. So I was just wondering whether, were you happy with that strength, or whether we should be looking perhaps further about, for distinguishing characteristics about refugees, to keep them as a prime concern, rather than just putting them into a general bigger pool of persons who might be.
Yeah, that's really great. I'm kind of agnostic. I go back and forth on it, because I do think it's nice to be able to say that this could be usefully applied to people within states that are powerless, to analyze why it is that they struggle the way they do. You know, Miranda Fricker, you know her book called Epistemic Injustice? She talks about the way that women, one of the harms that occur to women, in particular as a group, is that their stories and their accounts often aren't seen as being valid, and she has this account of she calls epistemic injustice, that their knowledge isn't taken seriously as knowledge, that I think is true exactly for refugees. So I think there is something useful and interesting about that, but I do still want to say that there's something unique about analyzing the situation of refugee camps as a distinct ontological deprivation, because so the third part, the agency part, would apply perhaps to other people, but the idea of being outside of a common world, being reduced to bare life, I don't know if those would necessarily apply. So I go back and forth between thinking it's useful and wanting to say, no, stateless people are really distinct. A distinct kind of harm is befalling them. And I do think even if you say it can be applied to other people internally, it's not going to be exactly the same as it is for refugees, at least the way the three kind of criteria get played out.
You might also tie that to the last question and say, so this brings back the importance of the political legal. So there may be other groups. I wasn't thinking of women. I was thinking particularly of those who are framed in terms of bodies. So the severely disabled, the elderly, those in extreme poverty. Even if they match all three, they don't match it with the connection to the political legal in the same way. So this might actually help you reintegrate the two of them. That it's the combination of the political legal and the ontological that leads to the particularly drastic nature of refugee harm. Because you know, one of the things that can happen, even if marginalized groups in a community don't have a voice, others can appeal to the status of citizen as a reason to speak for them. And what stateless persons lack is exactly that appeal to status. So it's sort of the double whammy, would be a not very technical way of putting it.
Double whammy. That's a great paper title.
You're welcome.
Maybe one final question back to Fiona.
Okay. I just have a question about how we're talking about rights, we're talking about harms, but how does that apply in countries like Canada and US, which are settler nations? So our citizenship is based on conquering and colonizing the indigenous peoples who are here in the first place. How would refugees take priority? Like, how would that work out? I'm sorry.
No, I think most people in America would not say that that's how the country was founded. It was founded to bring freedom and overcome tyranny. And that's perfectly consistent with this. But you know, you sort of pointed the hypocrisy at the foundation of the state, right? That states are, use power and injustice in order to achieve what they consider to be a legitimate state over people who then they deem to be not real people and therefore not worthy of political rights and citizenship and certainly material benefits that go along with that. So I don't know how to answer that question, except to say that probably people who want to defend a statist view that we have a right to limit immigration and limit people even with strong moral claims would deny that that's the basis of their state. Freedom.
All right. Well, please join me in thanking Professor Parekh.